Detective Caleb Rourke turned into his driveway, just in time to see 3 HOA guards rolling his safe toward an unmarked truck. Their supervisor waved a fabricated seizure order and claimed the property belonged to the association. Caleb did not argue. He photographed every face, every plate, and every forged signature because he had seen that same document before. For 6 months, he had been investigating a burglary ring hiding stolen assets behind HOA enforcement actions. The guards thought they had chosen an empty house. They had walked into the home of the detective quietly building the case against them. Stay with Caleb as one stolen safe exposes the HOA scheme, its inside accomplice, and the woman who ordered everything. Caleb Rourke came home to Briar Hollow Estates earlier than planned that afternoon, straight from a meeting with prosecutor Elliot Vance. The moment he turned onto his street, he saw a gray, unmarked truck parked outside his house, its rear doors open. The garage stood wide open. The side door showed fresh pry marks along the frame. 3 men in matching uniforms from Whitcomb Community Security, the private firm the Homeowners Association had hired, were guiding an industrial dolly loaded with his nearly 300-pound safe out through the garage. Caleb did not rush forward. Years as a detective had trained his instincts, and the first thing he did was raise his phone and start recording. He captured each man's face, the license plate on the truck, the dolly itself, the broken lock on the side door, the numbers stitched onto their uniforms, and the paper the lead guard was holding. That guard, a broad-shouldered man named Travis Boone, saw Caleb watching but showed no sign of alarm. He announced, almost bored, that the association had seized the property to secure an unpaid debt. Caleb asked what debt. Travis held out a document titled Emergency Property Recovery Authorization, claiming Caleb owed the association $18,460 in fines, legal costs, and enforcement fees. Caleb knew instantly the paper was fraudulent, not only because he had never owed the association a single dollar, but because the notary stamp in the corner sat slightly crooked, tilted to the left, in a way he had seen 3 times before stamped across 3 other documents currently, sitting in his open case file. For half a year, the Major Crimes Unit had quietly investigated a string of strange incidents across several communities. Homeowners were suddenly accused of owing the association money. Valuable property was then seized under the banner of enforcement. Watches, jewelry, legally owned firearms, cash, antiques, and electronics vanished from official records soon after. No one had yet proven these cases were connected. Standing in his own driveway, Caleb finally had that proof staring back at him. He kept his badge in his pocket for the moment and asked simply who had signed the order. Travis pointed to the signature at the bottom. Mallory Whitcomb, President, Briar Hollow Homeowners Association. Caleb had met Mallory only twice before, both times at community events, where she carried herself with the polished warmth of someone who had learned exactly how to be liked in public. She remembered names. She complimented lawns. She sent handwritten notes to new residents welcoming them to the neighborhood. Nothing about those brief encounters had suggested the woman capable of authorizing an armed crew to break into a house and haul away a safe. Caleb reminded himself that the calm, gracious face people saw at block parties rarely matched the one behind closed doors, and he had learned long ago never to judge the shape of a crime by the manners of the person who ordered it. Caleb looked at his safe, then back at the paper, and told Travis to put it back inside the house. Travis smiled and said the detective no longer had the authority to decide that. Cole Harlan, another guard, stepped forward and tried to push Caleb back off his own driveway, a mistake he would come to regret. Caleb raised his badge and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Derek Sloan, the youngest of the 3, froze where he stood. Cole let go of Caleb's arm. But Travis only paused for a few seconds before saying that whether Caleb was a detective or not changed nothing about the association's order. What actually caught Caleb's attention was not Travis's attitude. It was the next sentence out of his mouth. Travis said they had been given a specific instruction to retrieve the safe located in the downstairs office. Caleb had never told the Homeowners Association he owned a safe, let alone where it sat inside his house. That detail existed in exactly one place, an internal security report filed with the police department years earlier after an old break-in attempt at his previous residence. Caleb looked hard at Travis. This was no longer a simple case of an association overstepping its authority. Someone inside the police department had handed his home address and the layout of his own house to the very people he was investigating. Caleb could have ordered an immediate arrest of all 3 guards right there in his driveway. Instead, he made a decision that surprised even Travis. He stepped back from the driveway and told them to take it. It cost him something to say those words. The safe held nothing irreplaceable, but it was still his, still sitting inside the house he had bought with his own money after years of overtime and careful saving. And watching strangers wheel it away without lifting a hand to stop them went against every instinct that had kept him alive on the job. He forced himself to remember that instinct and strategy were not always the same thing, and that the version of justice worth having was the kind built on proof, not on a single satisfying arrest in a driveway. Travis assumed the detective had simply given up. In truth, Caleb was already thinking 3 moves ahead, the way any good investigator learns to think under pressure. If he arrested 3 low-level guards on the spot, all the department would have was trespassing, a broken lock, a forged document, and a conspiracy to seize property. But if he followed the safe to wherever it ended up, he might finally uncover the entire network behind these thefts. There was one more thing working in his favor. The safe held no case files. Caleb never brought official evidence home. Inside sat only personal papers, an old wristwatch, some property records, and a small steel lockbox. Months earlier, after a break-in elsewhere in the neighborhood, Caleb had installed a discreet tracking device inside his own safe as a precaution. He quietly activated it now out of sight. Travis and Cole loaded the safe onto the truck, while Derek kept glancing at Caleb, clearly uneasy about what they were doing. Before the doors closed, Caleb looked straight at Travis and told him he had better be certain the person who hired him understood exactly what he had just done. Travis answered that Mr. Whitcomb understood perfectly well. Caleb caught the slip immediately. Mr. Whitcomb. Mallory Whitcomb was the association president. There was no Mr. Whitcomb on the board, no husband listed anywhere in the community records Caleb had already reviewed. Travis realized his mistake and slammed the truck door shut before Caleb could press further. The truck pulled away. His colleague, Tessa Langford, arrived minutes later, and Caleb showed her the video and the forged authorization. Tessa recognized the font, the notary stamp, and the reference number immediately. They matched 4 unresolved cases, sitting in their shared file cases. They had never been able to formally connect until this moment. The 2 of them began tracking the signal from the safe, but they did not follow in a marked cruiser. They kept their distance, watching the blue dot crawl across the map on Tessa's laptop. The truck did not head toward the association's small management office. It left Briar Hollow entirely, crossed through an industrial stretch on the edge of town, and finally stopped outside a warehouse belonging to a company called Vale Asset Recovery and Auctions. Caleb already knew that name. 3 items from earlier unsolved cases had turned up, listed in past auction catalogs run by a man named Preston Vale, though no one had ever proven Vale knew the items were stolen. Now his own safe had been driven directly to Vale's loading dock. Tessa wanted to request a search warrant immediately. Caleb told her to wait. He wanted to see who came to claim the safe first. They watched from a distance as 40 minutes passed. Then a white luxury SUV pulled into the lot and a woman stepped out. Mallory Whitcomb. She did not walk toward the front office. She walked directly to the loading dock at the rear of the building, where Travis was already waiting to let her inside. Caleb zoomed his camera in and caught sight of a single sheet of paper in Mallory's hand, with a line printed clearly at the top: Rourke Priority Retrieval. It struck Caleb almost immediately that something did not add up. If the association simply wanted to sell off seized property, Mallory had no reason to drive out to the warehouse herself. She was looking for something specific. Through the telephoto lens, Caleb watched her argue with Travis, watched Preston Vale himself step out to join them. The 3 of them gathered tightly around the safe. A locksmith was called in. Caleb and Tessa documented everything from their observation point, careful not to lose a single frame. When the safe finally opened, Mallory practically shoved past the others to search it herself. She dug through the papers, opened every small box, checked behind each drawer twice. Her frustration was obvious even from a distance. Tessa finally voiced the question hanging between them. If she did not care about the valuables, what exactly was she looking for? Caleb's mind went back to something that had happened 3 days earlier. An anonymous source had reached out claiming to possess a financial ledger that would prove Mallory had been funneling money out of the association through a network of shell companies. That source wanted to meet him in person, though the meeting had never taken place. That source was Mara Ellison, the association's former treasurer. Caleb had never spoken her name to anyone outside his small investigative team. Yet a single note buried in the case file mentioned that Caleb was expecting to receive physical documents from a source that weekend. Mallory could easily have learned about that note. She believed Caleb was keeping the ledger inside his safe. Tessa said quietly that this had never really been a robbery at all. Caleb agreed. It was a search for evidence disguised as an enforcement seizure, and that meant whoever had leaked this information did not just know his address. They had access to the case file itself. Caleb called Elliot Vance and asked him to quietly restrict digital access to the file without explaining why yet. Together they pulled the access log and found 5 names had viewed the record within the last 72 hours. Caleb himself, Tessa, Elliot, a records technician, and Lieutenant Owen Pike, a man who had repeatedly pushed Caleb to close the HOA investigation, insisting there was never enough evidence of a real crime. Pike had been Caleb's supervisor for nearly 4 years, a steady, unremarkable presence in the department who signed off on paperwork, sat through budget meetings, and rarely raised his voice about anything. He had questioned the HOA investigation more than once, always with the same tired argument that fraud cases involving homeowners associations belonged in civil court, not on a detective's already crowded desk. Caleb had chalked it up to a lieutenant protecting his numbers and keeping the unit's caseload manageable. Now that same name sat inside a log showing exactly when someone had opened the file describing the layout of Caleb's own house, and the tired argument suddenly looked less like caution and more like cover. Back at the warehouse, Mallory's anger boiled over when she failed to find what she wanted. The camera caught her hurling a stack of papers at Travis before storming toward her car. Minutes later, Travis made a phone call Caleb could not hear, and shortly after that, Derek Sloan left the warehouse alone, driving not toward Caleb's house but back into Briar Hollow, straight toward Mara Ellison's street. Caleb understood instantly. If the ledger was not sitting in the detective's safe, then whoever had leaked the information assumed it must still be in the hands of the person who had offered to hand it over in the first place. He and Tessa abandoned their post at the warehouse and raced toward Mara's home, the quiet surveillance operation suddenly turning into a desperate pursuit. Caleb tried calling Mara's phone along the way, but no one picked up, and the tracking signal from Derek's vehicle showed it had already come to a stop directly outside her front door. Caleb and Tessa reached Mara's neighborhood within minutes. They kept their lights off until the very last stretch, careful not to alert anyone monitoring a police radio. When Caleb arrived, Mara's front door stood open, and a Whitcomb security vehicle sat parked crookedly against the curb. Derek was already inside. Caleb and Tessa moved through the entryway and found him standing in the study, not attacking Mara, but arguing with her, both of them talking over one another in raised, frightened voices. Caleb drew his weapon low and ordered Derek to raise his hands. Derek complied instantly, and Mara stepped back from him, visibly shaken but unharmed. What followed changed the shape of the entire case. Derek confessed that Travis had sent him to retrieve what he called a blue folder of documents. But standing in the home of a former association member with no court order and no official presence beyond his own uniform, Derek had started to question everything he had been told. He no longer wanted any part of it. More importantly, he revealed that Mallory had used the security team to carry out dozens of what she called property recovery operations over the past 2 years. Every single time, Travis assured his men that a lawyer had already signed off on the paperwork. The guards simply delivered the seized property to Vail Asset Recovery. Derek had never once seen any of that property returned to its rightful owner. Mara finally told her side of the story in full. As treasurer, she had noticed a growing list of strange expenses labeled as security remediation, emergency compliance, legal recovery, and abandoned property storage. But the money was not going where the labels claimed. It was flowing into a handful of limited liability companies that employed no one at all. One of those companies belonged to Preston Vail. Another had ties to Travis Boone's security firm. Mara had quietly copied the ledger before Mallory discovered what she was doing. 2 days later, a sudden disciplinary vote forced Mara out of her position entirely, and the fines against her began almost immediately afterward. Mara described the months that followed as the loneliest stretch of her life. Neighbors she had known for years suddenly crossed the street rather than speak to her, repeating rumors Mallory had planted about missing funds and a treasurer who could not be trusted with the books. Her own name had been quietly rewritten into the villain of a story she never got to tell her own version of, and she had spent nearly a year gathering the courage to hand her evidence to someone who might actually listen. Sitting across from Caleb in her study badge, finally in front of her instead of a fabricated invoice, she said it felt like being believed again for the first time in longer than she could remember. Mara had never actually given the ledger to Caleb because she realized she was being watched. She hid it somewhere else instead. When Caleb asked where she said it was not anywhere Mallory would think to look, she produced a small storage key. The ledger sat inside a rented lockbox at a commercial storage facility across town. But before Caleb could retrieve it, Tessa's phone lit up with an alert. Someone had just used Caleb's own login credentials to access a restricted witness protection file back at the department. Caleb was standing right in front of her. That meant his credentials had been duplicated, and whoever was using them was inside the building at that very moment. Tessa pulled the login camera footage. Owen Pike was sitting in the records room. Caleb did not confront Owen right away. He understood the larger danger. If he arrested Pike before learning exactly what he had already handed over to Mallory, the entire network might scatter before there was enough evidence to hold anyone accountable. Caleb, Tessa, and Elliot quietly formed a small team operating outside the normal chain of command. They pulled Pike's full access history and found he had opened victim statements from the HOA cases, witness addresses, interview schedules, evidence inventories, a draft search warrant, and the internal report describing the exact location of the safe inside Caleb's home. Worse, still hours before the theft, Pike had opened that very document describing the safe's location in the downstairs office. The connection was now undeniable. Caleb wanted direct proof that Pike had passed information to Mallory herself, so the team set a trap. They created a false record inside the department system labeled Confidential Ellison Ledger Recovery, stating that Mara would deliver the original ledger to Caleb at an abandoned property at 11 o'clock that night. Only Pike's account and a handful of monitored accounts could view that file. No one told Pike anything directly. 2 hours later, Mallory called an emergency security meeting of her own. Travis Boone and 4 guards left association headquarters together. Caleb followed at a careful distance, and their destination confirmed everything the very same abandoned property named in the fake record. The leak was now essentially proven. Still, Caleb wanted to hear Mallory give the order herself. The team positioned surveillance around the perimeter, using only legally authorized equipment, careful to protect the integrity of the case. Mara was nowhere near the location. There was no real ledger, only an empty document box placed exactly where the fake file said it would be. At 7 minutes past 11, Mallory arrived, driving herself rather than sending someone else. Travis asked what they should do if the detective showed up. Mallory's answer changed the entire trajectory of the investigation. She said that Pike would handle Rourke, and that the guards simply needed to retrieve the ledger. Caleb heard every word. Now they had Pike's name spoken directly from Mallory's mouth. But just as Caleb prepared to signal the arrest, his phone buzzed with an alert from his home security system. Someone had just returned to his house. The cameras showed 2 figures carrying large duffel bags inside, not removing anything but placing something into the house instead. Caleb understood the second plan almost instantly. If the ledger could not be found inside the safe, Mallory and Pike intended to destroy the credibility of the man investigating them instead. Caleb did not rush home himself. He requested an independent team secure the scene and document everything before anyone touched a single item inside. The 2 intruders fled the moment they spotted an approaching patrol car. One was caught nearby. The other escaped into the darkness. Inside Caleb's house, officers found the bags exactly where the intruders had left them. They contained cash jewelry, later identified as belonging to a previous HOA victim, financial paperwork and property, already reported missing from 2 earlier cases. Had these items simply been discovered without any record of how they arrived, Caleb himself could easily have become the primary suspect. Mallory would have claimed the very detective investigating the association was the one holding stolen property all along. Caleb felt the full weight of it settle over him. This was no longer about protecting a criminal network from exposure. They had moved to destroying his career outright. The man who had been caught was a contract worker previously employed by Preston Vale. Once shown the security footage, he began cooperating almost immediately, explaining that Preston took orders from Travis and Travis took orders from Mallory. He knew nothing about Pike specifically. Meanwhile, Mallory realized the 11 o'clock meeting had been a trap the moment no ledger appeared, and she ordered everyone to leave the abandoned property at once. Caleb chose not to arrest her that night. He wanted the final layer of the network first. Tessa dug deeper into the financial records tied to Vale asset recovery and discovered that property seized from HOA victims was routinely sold through private closed auctions. The proceeds moved through 3 separate shell companies. Some of that money flowed back into accounts Mallory controlled personally. Some paid Travis's security firm directly, but one recurring monthly payment went to a consulting company registered to a post office box. Its true owner was Owen Pike. He had not simply leaked case files out of carelessness. He had been paid to do it month after month. Preston Vale's role in the operation was in some ways the simplest to understand. He ran a legitimate auction house on paper, complete with a storefront, a website, and a mailing list of regular bidders who had no idea where certain items had actually come from. Investigators later learned he took a modest cut on every sale, a percentage that seemed small on any single transaction but added up quickly across dozens of homes and hundreds of individual items over several years. He never asked too many questions about where the merchandise originated, and in later interviews he would insist he genuinely believed the paperwork Travis handed him each time was legitimate. Whether that claim held up in court would be for a jury to decide, but the transaction records left behind a trail no amount of professed ignorance could erase. Elliot began preparing formal search and arrest warrants, but Caleb still wanted to secure Mara's original ledger first. Mara led them to the storage facility, and the box was opened under camera to preserve the chain of custody. Inside sat printed wire transfers, authentic association, meeting minutes alongside forged ones, a full list of seized property, internal emails, auction lot numbers, and a copy of the contract binding the association to Vale asset recovery. On the very last page was something Caleb had not anticipated at all. A list of 23 addresses. Beside each one sat a projected dollar figure, the estimated value the network expected to gain if that particular homeowner could be pressured into selling. Caleb's own address sat fourth on the list. This had never been only about a single safe. Mallory had been planning to take his entire house. The ledger blew the case open far beyond anything Caleb had originally imagined. Mallory was not merely stealing individual pieces of property, she was running a long-term operation. Homeowners with desirable lots or high-value homes would suddenly face a wave of violations: painted trim fence, height, landscaping, parking, followed by special assessments, legal fees, and security charges. The debt would climb rapidly. The association would then claim the authority to enforce collection. Travis's team would appear at the door. Frightened homeowners often chose to sell rather than continue fighting, and those houses were quietly purchased afterward through companies linked back to Preston Vale at prices far below their real value. Mallory profited twice over: once from whatever sat inside the home and again from the property itself. Caleb finally understood why he had become a target in the first place. His house sat near land Mallory hoped to consolidate into a new luxury development. But there was a second, more personal reason. Pike had already warned her that Caleb was closing in on the network, and Mallory wanted to seize any evidence in his possession while simultaneously forcing him out of Briar Hollow entirely. It was Caleb realized a strategy that had likely worked before on people with far less training than he had. Most homeowners facing sudden fines and aggressive enforcement did not think to question the paperwork, did not know how to trace a shell company, and had no colleague willing to run a financial trail across state lines. They simply grew exhausted, sold their homes at a loss, and moved on, never once suspecting the entire ordeal had been engineered from the start. Mallory had built her operation on that exhaustion, betting that fear and confusion would always outrun curiosity. She had simply never accounted for a target who investigated crimes for a living. This was the turning point where Caleb shifted from a man playing defense to a man taking full command of the investigation. He and Elliot filed for a sweeping set of warrants built on the home security footage, the tracking data from the safe, the warehouse surveillance, Derek's statement, Mara's statement, Pike's access logs, the financial trail, the recording of Mallory naming Pike directly, and the planted evidence found inside Caleb's own home. Pike, however, noticed his access privileges had been quietly restricted and realized he had been discovered. He called Mallory, and the team operating under proper legal authority intercepted the communication. Pike demanded she erase every record connecting them. Mallory instead ordered Travis to clear out whatever remained inside the warehouse before sunrise. It was the single biggest mistake of her operation, because Caleb had already anticipated exactly that move. Rather than storming the warehouse immediately, Caleb positioned units along the main routes, leading away from the property. Around 4:20 that morning, 6 trucks pulled out of Vale Asset Recovery in different directions, each one loaded with property taken from a different set of victims. Caleb sat in the surveillance vehicle, watching them scatter across the map. Tessa asked which truck they should stop. Caleb told her all of them. The units moved in together, and one by one, every truck was pulled over and secured. Inside, one officers found records listing the exact source address of every single item. Inside another sat several more safes. A third truck carried documents Mallory believed had already been destroyed. Travis Boone was arrested trying to leave the warehouse himself. He did not resist, and in the back of the patrol car he grew unusually quiet, staring out the window at the warehouse lights, as officers continued cataloging the contents of each recovered truck. Whatever loyalty he had once felt toward Mallory seemed to drain out of him the moment he understood how thoroughly the operation had been documented, and by morning his attorney would be the one reaching out to Elliot's office, rather than the other way around. Mallory was nowhere to be found. Pike had also vanished from the department. Both of their phones went dark within minutes of one another at almost the exact same moment. The next morning, Mallory called an emergency meeting of the Homeowners Association, hoping to control the narrative before word of the arrests spread any further. She stood before the board and claimed the security team had simply included a few dishonest employees acting on their own. She denied any knowledge of Vale's operations and went further still, accusing Caleb of abusing his position to settle a personal grudge against the association. A few board members appeared ready to believe her. Mallory produced records claiming Caleb owed thousands of dollars in unpaid fines, but she had no idea Caleb was holding original copies of every one of those documents. Each fine had been generated after the exact date Pike first accessed the investigation file, meaning the fines were never the cause of any real dispute. They had been manufactured only after Mallory learned she was being investigated. Caleb walked into that meeting not alone. Tessa stood beside him. Elliot Vance stood behind them with a team ready to execute the remaining warrants. Caleb did not argue with Mallory. He simply placed a copy of the forged authorization used to seize his own safe on the table in front of her, followed by 3 more forged orders taken from earlier victims, each sharing the same notary stamp, the same structure, the same origin. Mallory tried to hold her composure until Derek Sloan walked in as a cooperating witness. Moments later, Mara Ellison followed. Mallory's control began visibly slipping, and she called the entire proceeding a conspiracy. Then the door opened once more, and Travis Boone was escorted through the hallway after signing a preliminary cooperation agreement with the prosecutor's office. Something in Mallory's expression changed the instant she saw him. Caleb understood exactly what she was realizing. Every person she had paid to stay silent was now turning against her one after another, but the heaviest blow was still to come. The search team opened a locked storage room behind the president's own office. Inside sat copies of every forged seizure order, the list of 23 target homes, a set of property keys, contracts for the shell, company's transfer records, and a phone used exclusively to communicate with Pike. An officer walked out carrying a single labeled box. It read simply Rourke. Mallory had kept an entire dedicated file on Caleb himself, containing his work schedule, photographs of his car notes on his daily routine, a sketch of his house, and the exact location of his safe. Caleb looked at the box, then back at Mallory. For the first time since this began, she had nothing left to say. Pike, however, was still out there. At that moment, Tessa's phone lit up with a message intercepted from Mallory's burner line. Pike had written, "Meet me where this started." Caleb knew immediately what that meant. Vale asset recovery. Caleb and the team drove straight to the warehouse. Pike had already arrived ahead of them, though not to protect Mallory. He had come to save himself. He was trying to remove a hard drive containing camera footage, contracts, and delivery logs before anyone could reach it. Preston Vale was there as well, and the two men argued bitterly once Vale realized the entire network was collapsing around him. Caleb did not move in right away. He let the team quietly seal off every exit first. When Pike spotted the officers, he tried to slip out through a rear door only to find it already blocked. The final confrontation between Caleb and Pike required no gunfire and no dramatic struggle at all. Caleb won it with the one thing Pike had underestimated from the very beginning: hard evidence. Pike tried to claim Caleb had fabricated the entire case out of some grudge against the association. Caleb calmly laid out the truth piece by piece. Pike had accessed the file before the break-in occurred. Information from that file appeared directly in Travis's hands soon after. Mallory named Pike by name in a recorded conversation. Pike's shell company received regular payments traced directly back to the network. Phone records confirmed repeated contact with Mallory. Planted evidence had been discovered inside Caleb's own home. Warehouse data documented every shipment leaving the building. There was nowhere left for him to go. Pike was arrested on the spot. Preston Vale was taken into custody alongside him. At almost the same moment, Elliot confirmed that Mallory Whitcomb had been arrested back at the association headquarters. The powerful board president, who once hid behind a wall of hired security, no longer had anyone left standing between her and the consequences of what she had built. There was no security team left to intimidate residents. There was no lieutenant left to make inconvenient files disappear. Caleb returned once more to the warehouse where his own safe still sat inside the evidence room. He looked at the deep scratch across its door, a mark left the day Mallory treated it as a prize worth chasing. Now that same safe stood as a key piece of evidence tracing the entire chain of stolen property. Tessa remarked quietly that Mallory had chosen the wrong house. Caleb corrected her gently, saying she had chosen exactly the right house to bring the whole operation to an end. The story did not stop with a handful of arrests. The financial investigation that followed revealed an operation far larger than anyone first believed. The list of 23 homes turned out to be only the next phase of a plan already underway. Older records showed dozens of homeowners across several communities had been targeted using the very same tactics over the preceding years. Investigators began the slow work of returning seized property to its rightful owners. Fraudulent fines came under formal review. Every questionable transaction tied to the network was re-examined line by line. People Mallory had once dismissed as liars and troublemakers began showing up with paperwork finally proving what they had said all along. Briar Hollow prepared for its very first homeowners meeting in years without Mallory Whitcomb sitting in the chairperson's seat. In the months that followed, the consequences of the case rippled outward across the entire community. Mallory lost all control of the association. The remaining members of her old board came under independent review of their own. The security firm lost its contract entirely. Vale Asset Recovery shut its doors permanently as the case worked its way through the courts. Every account tied to the network was frozen under proper legal authority. Numerous liens and questionable penalties were reopened for review. Property that could still be identified slowly began making its way back to the families it had been taken from. One by one, letters went out to homeowners who had never understood why their fines kept climbing or why their property had disappeared during a so-called compliance inspection years earlier. Some of them had already moved away, convinced the whole ordeal had simply been bad luck. A retired school teacher, 2 streets over, finally learned what had happened to a set of her late husband's tools, seized under a violation she had never actually committed. An elderly couple who sold their home at a steep loss after months of relentless fines received a formal letter acknowledging the fines had been fraudulent from the very beginning. None of it could fully undo what had been lost, but for many of them, simply having the truth confirmed in writing mattered more than they expected it to. Mara Ellison gave a full and complete statement providing the financial detail investigators needed to trace every dollar. Derek Sloan became an essential witness, able to explain exactly how the so-called enforcement orders were passed down to the security team in the first place. Travis Boone handed over emails, text messages, and direct instructions he had received from Mallory herself. Pike faced perhaps the harshest professional reckoning of all, as every case he had ever touched during his years on the force came under fresh scrutiny. Caleb eventually received his safe back. The door still bore its deep scratch. One corner remained slightly dented from the day it was hauled out of his house. He chose not to repair it. He kept the marks exactly as they were, not as some kind of trophy, but as a quiet reminder that the biggest case of his career had once shown up uninvited on his own front step. Colleagues who heard the full story afterward often asked Caleb why he had let Travis load the safe onto that truck in the first place, instead of arresting him on the spot. He always gave the same answer. A single arrest in a driveway would have closed one small door while leaving every other door in the network wide open. Patience more than any single piece of evidence was what had ultimately unraveled Mallory Whitcomb's operation from the inside out, one careful step at a time, until there was nowhere left for anyone involved to hide. The final scene of this story unfolded outside Mallory's own home. Investigators arrived to execute a lawful search of property connected to the case. A large safe belonging to Mallory herself was wheeled out through her front door to be logged as evidence. Mallory stood inside, no security team surrounding her. Now no authority left to give a single order. Caleb stood out on the driveway watching. The image was almost identical to the afternoon he had first caught Travis hauling his own safe away. Only one thing had changed. This time every document involved was real. Mallory looked at him and said that he had destroyed everything she had built. Caleb did not argue the point. He simply told her that he had not destroyed anything at all. He had only written down exactly how she built it. Her safe was loaded onto the truck. The doors closed behind it. Caleb turned and walked away before it ever pulled out of the driveway. Briar Hollow did not transform overnight into some perfect neighborhood free of trouble. But the authority once held by a single unchecked association finally returned to its proper limits. Residents who had once been too afraid to speak up began attending meetings again. Financial records were open to independent audit. Security contracts were reviewed line by line before renewal. And the house Mallory once marked down as nothing more than a future acquisition became the exact place where her entire operation finally came apart. The new interim board adopted a rule within its first month that every enforcement action, no matter how small, required 2 independent signatures and a documented paper trail available to any resident who requested it. It was a simple change, almost embarrassingly obvious in hindsight, and more than one longtime resident admitted they wished someone had insisted on it years earlier. Caleb never sat on that board and never wanted to. He had spent enough of his own life proving what should have been obvious from the start, and he preferred to leave the rebuilding to the people who actually had to live there every day. Mallory sent guards to steal a detective's safe because she feared what evidence it might contain inside. She never once considered that the theft itself would become the very evidence that buried her entire operation for good.